So, Warren, has the Eurozone's approach to the Greek economic and debt crisis failed?
Has it failed? What is their goal? I would say what's failed is that their policies have failed to restore output and employment. In fact, gone the other way. They've caused unemployment to go higher and output to go down. So in that sense, those policies have failed.
Well, the Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times today that was released, and in it he wrote, quote, "Our government is not asking our partners for a way out of repaying our debts. We are asking for a few months of financial stability that will allow us to embark upon the task of reforms that the broad Greek population can own and support, so we can bring back growth and end our inability to pay our dues." That sounds well and good, but the economic group, formerly known as the Troika, is saying to Greece, either follow the existing program or suffer dire consequences. It doesn't look very good, does it?
Now, see, what they're doing was asking for time to come up with an alternative to what the previous government's already agreed to. And the Troika is saying, look, you've got to stand by your agreements. And so that's the impasse right now. And what's interesting is that the Greek government now has indicated that it wants to remain in the union and that it doesn't, and it wants to remain with the euro, and that, and I can give you some of the reasons, but they definitely want to remain. And in fact, they don't feel exit is an option, is a viable option. They think that if there is any kind of an exit, the economy collapses and the government would probably fall, and they're worried about a right-wing uprising. And so they have taken away all their leverage by saying that we want to remain in the EU at all costs. And so they can say whatever they want, but what it comes down to is you either have to comply or you risk either not actually, not being in the EU. Now, I know there's no actual expulsion, but functionally being cut off and having the economy collapse and the government fail.
So now, Warren, do you think there is the possibility that behind the scenes they're thinking we actually could do a Eurozone exit if we're forced into a corner, but that they just haven't explicitly said that?
I think that they're thinking that they cannot do that, because if you look at the same finance minister's piece on why he cannot do that, he goes into some detail on it. Now, I think it's flawed, but this is what he believes. They can't go to a drachma because they have no notes and coins, and that would take a number of years before they could do it, and they think it's a cash economy, so they can't do that. They think that under a crisis scenario, the banking system fails, and the whole economy comes to a screeching halt, and you have blood in the streets, and the government falls. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case either, but they do. They believe it. And so they see themselves with no alternative but to, at the end of the day, do whatever the Troika tells them to do and hopefully get to save a little face in that acceptance.
So now, Warren, what is a currency issuer, and how does that status differ from a currency user status?
Okay, so all currencies have an issuer. The currency doesn't exist until somebody tells you it exists, and generally that's through defining tax liabilities as payable in that currency. So the dollar is the thing that the federal government, U.S. government, accepts to pay taxes to the federal government, U.S. government. The euro is the thing that the European governments accept for payment of taxes. So the definition is the tax credit, the thing that's defined as what's acceptable for the payment of taxes. And so the one doing that, the one imposing the tax liability in their own currency, which they define in the tax liability itself, that's the issuer of the currency. And then everyone else is a user of the currency.
So now Rob Parento, he has an idea that Wolfgang Munchau endorsed in the Financial Times newspaper for the Greek government about this, to pay local contractors in notes that are similar to bearer bonds, usable for repayment of Greek taxes instead of using euros for payments domestically. What are the pros and cons of such an idea, and does that take advantage of Greece's potentially being a currency issuer?
Okay, well, that allows Greece to fund itself, and it's very similar to what I proposed and actually worked with the Greek government on several years ago that became known as Mosler bonds, which the bonds didn't have any default provision. Instead, they said in the event of non-payment, they could be used to pay taxes. So it is basically the same thing, and it does work financially. However, the Greek government has made it clear that the Troika has made it clear that if they start doing any of these things to be able to fund themselves, independently fund themselves, and therefore not follow the reform program that the prior government agreed to, that they were going to suffer consequences for that, such as, in the implied consequence being failure of the banking system, collapsed economy, somehow expulsion from the union, whatever that means, cutting off of subsidies, but what they considered unacceptable consequences. So they don't feel they have any of these funding mechanisms as an option to buy time. Just the simple fact of doing anything that might buy time against the Troika's wishes is a violation. And so those options have all been taken off the table. I had proposed for Italy something they had heard about and looked at, which was to accelerate value-added taxes. And it's the same thing. Yes, it works financially, but right now, if we do that, we're going to get cut off and expelled. So it's not an option.
I'm assuming that that's why the Greek government can't simply default. Now, what would you do?
Default risks expulsion.
Right. Now, what would you do if you were negotiating for the Greek government?
Okay, so you'd have to tell me what my instructions were. So if my instructions were, yes, worst comes to worst, we can leave and we can establish our own currency and pursue our own domestic full employment policy, I'd negotiate one way. If I was told, no, we can't leave the union, you've got to negotiate something for us while we stay in the European Union, I'd negotiate a different one. So you'd have to give me those instructions first, and then I can give you both. I can give you answers accordingly.
Well, going back to what you said earlier, obviously, if you have the option on the table to exit the Eurozone unilaterally, then that's going to give you much more leverage. So let's say you had to negotiate under that pretense.
Okay, I would then, express the demands. Okay, and I'd be prepared to, and I would explain to them exactly how I was going to go back to the drachma, which is to immediately begin taxing and spending in drachma. Yes, we don't have notes and coins, but we'll let people use euro in the meantime until we get to those. I don't see how that would be a particular problem. And with regards to the banking system, I don't see why that would necessarily fail or collapse. We're not going to convert bank deposits. The banks would still have euro deposits and euro loans, and they'd still be members of the European Central Bank. They're private institutions. They are not the government. And that membership does not require the government be in the European Union. And so, operationally, it's not required. And these banks are already supervised and regulated by the European Central Bank system and deemed to have adequate capital and be eligible for collateral and eligible for liquidity and all the other, participate as all the other banks do. And so there's no reason for the European Central Bank to punish the Greek banks, which aren't government-owned, because of the government starting its own currency.
Warren, the Eurogroup is meeting today to discuss the situation in Greece. From what I have heard, most European countries are looking to take a hard line against the new Greece government and their proposal for debt relief. What are Greece's real options now at this particular time?
Well, given the other alternative, which we didn't discuss, which is, you have to stay in the union, then your only option is to do whatever they dictate. And I think the others realize that the leverage is not there and that whatever the Troika dictates, they have to do. And if they break ranks here, they're just going to be subject to the same thing. The population of Greece wants to stay with Euro. They want to stay in the European Union. I think it was 70% or something like that at this point. Okay, and so for the others to break ranks and side with Greece is almost unthinkable politically. Not that I wouldn't do it if I were them, but for the particular individuals involved, I think it's almost unthinkable. Now, if I were negotiating for Greece and I had to stay in the union, then what would I do, right? Now my job is to convince the Troika and the others that, A, their policies don't work, which isn't too hard to do. They can see the statistics. But then explain why they're not working and what they can do to make the entire European Union work in hope that they move in that direction. And a lot of those things would involve Greece getting, quote, the concessions that it's asking for, are really things that should be done across the union. And the first thing is that 3% deficit limit has to go. It has to be raised from 3% to maybe 8%. And maybe they would raise it a little bit every year, maybe 1% a year for 4 or 5 years until the unemployment rate got down to where they wanted it to. And the justification behind that, and this is how I would argue, I'm not saying I'd win the argument, but I give it a good go, is that what's happened to the European Union is that they are punishing the good savers. Okay, the reason Greece had a high deficit, even Belgium, Italy, the others, is because the government deficit equals the savings in the private sector, and there's a very high propensity for the economy to be a net saver. They just like to save and not spend. And so that economies that like to save for whatever reason and not spend require some entity to spend more than it takes in, and that responsibility has fallen on government, which then spends more than it taxes, or taxes less than it spends. It's the same thing, depending on your politics. And so Greece, Italy, were always able to operate successfully with lower taxes for any given amount of spending because there's the people were good people, they were good savers, okay? And so when the European Union came along and said, we're limiting your deficits, what they said was, we're not going to allow you to accommodate your desires to save. We're going to punish the good savers and reward the bad savers. And the countries that did better were the ones like Germany had lower deficits because they weren't as good a saver, on net as Italy and Greece.
Now, see, the problem I have with that argument, though, Warren, is that, obviously you have the external account that comes into play, and we know that the Germans, post-2005, ran up an enormous current account surplus, and the Greeks and also the rest of the periphery had a current account deficit. So really, in terms of what was driving the government balance, you could make the argument that it was actually the Germans and their new programs under Hartz IV and so forth that was actually causing this, and that it wasn't the actual savings of the periphery.
Yeah, but that's a different point. The point here is that if the deficit limit was expanded from 3% to 8%, then the periphery would have enough net savings to have their unemployment rates drop dramatically. Mm-hmm. And Germany, for whatever reason, doesn't need it. And the others need it because of their savings desire, okay? And don't forget, Germany was a pretty large exporter to the rest of Europe. Isn't that, I forget the percentage, maybe 70% or something like that. And before European Union, of course, that was accomplished by Germany buying their currencies. Okay, so that was kind of a symbiotic relationship. I remember the kind of reluctantly, maybe kicking and screaming, but Germany's buying all these lira. Well, at the end of the day, this was supporting their exporters and supporting the export-driven economy, right? And so, but what I would, again, I'm not saying I would absolutely win this argument, but I think I would, because the argument is there, and you can look at the foreign balances, and they're not large enough, okay, to account for all the differences. There's Germany could still do marginally better than Italy or Spain, but they wouldn't have, Italy wouldn't be at 13% unemployment and Greece wouldn't be at 25. Maybe Italy would be at 6 and Germany would be at 3. Okay, the differentials would be at levels that you could talk about in civilized company, not these obscene levels of unemployment and destruction of civilization that, it's not wrong to call it a crime against humanity. Look what they've done across Europe. And not that it's part of the equation, but if you look at German consumption, it hasn't done well. So what's happened is the bar's been lowered so much that Germany's doing relatively better than everyone else, but on an absolute basis, it's not doing well. And certainly, the unemployment just got down into the 6s. That's not, unemployment's supposed to be at 3%, right? Not 6, 5.5, 6, 7. Definitely. These are just, because of the prolonged period of let's call it depression, the bar's just gotten set so low that if Italian unemployment went from 13 to 12.7, they'd have dancing in the streets. All right, so that's a different matter. Okay, so the whole thing is just a mess. If you look at what's happened to real wages, if you look at the trade surplus now that the European Union's running, was it just 24 billion announced last night?
Right, and for the whole year, it was a record. I think it was 170 some billion euros.
Yeah. So what does that tell you? They've reduced real wages to a point where they're competing by having their workers consume fewer calories a day so they can export something to a world that's trying to do the same thing. rather than supporting domestic demand like they used to.
Let me ask you this, Warren.
But again, if the European Union realizes that the policies have been backwards, it's not their values to reward, profligate spending and to punish thrift. But that's exactly what they've been doing. They've been punishing populations of thrift and rewarding populations of less thrift. And so if they could understand it was counter to every basic value they have, I think there'd be a chance of having the policy relaxed from that point of view, because that puts the morality, that turns the morality around from what they think it is to what it actually is.
Now, from what I understand, other periphery countries like Portugal, Ireland, and Spain, they've taken a hard line regarding Greece. My question is why, and how different is Greece from the rest of the periphery?
It's been self-preservation, right? Now, what's happened is when Mario Draghi said, we'll do what it takes to prevent default, suddenly the financial crisis was over, the rates crisis was over, interest rates started coming down, everyone could fund themselves again. And they all became beholden on the central bank to be able to fund themselves. And their memories aren't that short. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago, right? 2.5 years ago. So they know that they're in the mercy of the European Central Bank, which became the only central bank in the world to actually dictate both monetary and fiscal policy, because they're holding this funding sword over the heads of the other members, and it was getting awfully close to France, and Germany's not too far away, and so they at the time, and then they and so these other countries know that if they step out of line, they lose their funding protection. They're faced with the same thing Greece is, which is high interest rates and the inability to fund themselves in a collapsing economy. It's even worse than it is now. And it was said about Greece, you think things are bad, yes, but they could get a lot worse. And that was one of the government statements. If we don't stay in the European Union, they could get a lot worse. Well, and they compared themselves to like Bulgaria or something, where it's worse.
Right. Are you hopeful for Europe, Warren, or are you concerned about the economic and political situation that it actually is going to get worse?
Yeah, I'm concerned that it is going to get worse, that Greece is not going to be the leader that will then cause positive change to happen. They're not taking that position. And I don't see any let-up in the austerity apart from, maybe they're going to continue to apply it, but maybe not as hard and not as fast or something like that. Bring your deficit down more slowly, bring your debt to GDP ratio down more slowly. There's no talk of relaxation of any of these things. There's no talk of that it's a failed policy and it's time to go the other way. I just don't see that anywhere. And I don't see it anywhere in the world. I don't even see it here in the United States. I see President Obama, who should be on the other side of that, based on where he supposedly is politically, still talking about what we have to do to bring down the deficit. And I see the progressives talking about we have to tax the rich to be able to bring the deficit down, right? And so the whole thing continues to go the wrong way as it's been going for far too long now.